The moment the baton tapped against the side of a $200,000 Ferrari, the entire street seemed to hold its breath, because it wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It was something else, something heavier, something personal. And under the flashing red and blue lights, Marcus Ellington stood beside his car, hands visible, posture calm, watching a stranger in uniform treat his property like it didn't belong to him, like he didn't belong to it, and maybe not even to this street. Step away from the vehicle, Officer Ryan Keller repeated, his voice edged with a confidence that came from the badge on his chest, not from the facts in front of him, and people nearby began to slow down, phones rising quietly, drawn by the tension that didn't need to be explained, because you could feel it in the air, thick and uncomfortable, like a storm about to break. Marcus didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't match the energy. Instead, he took one small step back, eyes steady, observing everything. The officer, the crowd, the camera mounted on the corner traffic light, even the reflection of those flashing lights dancing across the polished red paint that had just been struck. And for a second, just a second, you might wonder why he was so calm, why he wasn't reacting the way most people would when something they worked for, something they earned, was being questioned in front of strangers. You really expect me to believe this is yours? Ryan said, circling the car slowly, his tone carrying that quiet assumption that didn't need to be spoken out loud, and Marcus exhaled, not in frustration, but in control, like a man measuring time instead of losing it, his gaze flicking briefly toward the intersection camera again, then back to the officer. And if you were standing there, you might start to feel it too, that something wasn't adding up, that this moment was bigger than what it looked like, because Marcus didn't look defeated. He looked patient, like he was waiting for something to arrive, or for someone to cross a line they couldn't step back from. And when Ryan reached for the door handle without permission, asserting authority that felt more like assumption than law, Marcus finally spoke, his voice low, even, almost quiet enough to miss if you weren't listening closely. Officer, this is your last clean minute. And the words didn't sound like a threat, they sounded like a warning, the kind that doesn't need to be repeated, the kind that lands differently once you realize what it actually means. But standing there in that moment, with phones recording and sirens humming and the weight of judgment hanging in the air, Officer Ryan Keller didn't realize that the situation he thought he controlled had already slipped beyond his reach. Because sometimes the most dangerous mistake isn't what you do, it's who you choose to do it to. Officer Ryan Keller let out a short laugh, the kind that did not come from humor, but from certainty, from the belief that he was still in control of the moment, of the street, of the man standing in front of him. My last minute? He repeated, shaking his head as he rested his hand on the edge of the Ferrari, eyes scanning Marcus as if trying to find the flaw that justified everything he had already decided. And around them the crowd shifted slightly, people exchanging glances, some whispering, under their breath, because they had heard the tone in Marcus's voice, and it did not match the situation. It did not match a man being questioned. It sounded like someone who already knew how this would end, and that was the part that made it uncomfortable. Ryan stepped closer, lowering his voice but sharpening it. You think you can talk your way out of this? And Marcus did not move, did not flinch. His hands still relaxed at his sides, his breathing steady, his eyes not angry but focused, as if he was watching a clock no one else could see. And then he glanced once more toward the intersection, toward that silent camera mounted above the street, capturing everything without bias, without opinion, just truth stored frame by frame. And for a moment it felt like the entire scene existed inside that lens. Every word, every gesture, every assumption, preserved, waiting. Ryan followed Marcus's gaze briefly, then dismissed it, because to him it was just another camera, another piece of the city, nothing that could challenge the authority he carried, nothing that could rewrite what he believed was happening here. License and registration, Ryan said again, more forcefully now, pushing the moment forward, but Marcus reached slowly into his pocket, not hurried, not nervous, just deliberate, and instead of immediately handing anything over, he paused, looking directly at Ryan. And there was something in that pause that stretched longer than it should have, something that made the air tighten again, because pauses like that are never empty. They are decisions, and Marcus was choosing exactly how the next few seconds would unfold. You are recording, right? Marcus asked quietly, not to Ryan, but to the space around them. to the phones held up, to the unseen witnesses beyond the frame. And a few people nodded without realizing they had, caught in the gravity of the moment, and Ryan frowned slightly, irritation flickering across his face, because control was slipping in small, subtle ways, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, like sand shifting under your feet. Answer me, Ryan snapped, trying to pull the scene back into his rhythm. But Marcus only gave a small nod, as if confirming something to himself, as if a checklist had just been completed, and then he finally spoke again, voice calm, almost measured. Good, he said, and there was no anger in it, no fear, just certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself. And somewhere in the distance, faint but growing, the low hum of approaching engines began to rise, barely noticeable at first, blending into the city noise, but steady, consistent, getting closer with every second. And Marcus did not look toward it, did not acknowledge it, because he did not need to. He already knew it was coming. And standing there under those flashing lights, surrounded by strangers who had become witnesses, Officer Ryan Keller still believed he was leading the situation, still believed he was the one asking the questions, not realizing that the answers had already been set in motion long before he ever stepped out of his patrol car. The low hum of engines grew louder, no longer blending into the city but cutting through it, precise and deliberate. And for the first time, Officer Ryan Keller's attention shifted away from Marcus Ellington, his eyes flicking down the street as two unmarked black SUVs turned the corner in perfect sequence, not speeding, not rushing, just arriving with purpose. And something about the way they moved, the way they stopped, made the air change again, because this was not coincidence, this was coordination. And Marcus remained exactly where he was, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, as if the scene unfolding was simply the next step in something already written. Ryan straightened slightly, adjusting his stance, trying to reclaim the authority that had begun to slip through his fingers. Stay right there, he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before, and the doors of the SUVs opened almost in unison, figures stepping out with calm precision, dressed in plain clothes, but moving with unmistakable intent. And suddenly the crowd fell quieter. Phones still raised but voices gone, because everyone could feel it now, the shift, the invisible line that had just been crossed. One of the agents approached, eyes scanning the scene once, taking in the Ferrari, the patrol car, the positioning of Ryan, and finally landing on Marcus. And in that brief moment their expressions aligned, not in surprise, but in recognition, like two people continuing a conversation that had started long before anyone else arrived. Sir, the agent said, his tone respectful, direct, and Ryan turned sharply, confusion breaking through the confidence he had been holding on to. What is this? Ryan demanded, stepping forward. But the question did not carry the same weight anymore. It sounded smaller now, thinner, like it had lost something essential. Marcus finally moved, reaching calmly into his jacket and pulling out his wallet, flipping it open with emotion that was neither rushed nor dramatic, just precise. And he held it up at eye level, not aggressively, not defensively, just enough for it to be seen clearly. And for a fraction of a second, time seemed to slow, the flashing lights reflecting off the badge inside, catching Ryan's eyes before the words even registered. Special Agent Marcus Ellington, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Marcus said, his voice even, controlled, and final. And the silence that followed was immediate and complete, the kind of silence that does not need to be asked for. It just arrives, heavy and undeniable. Ryan stared at the badge, then back at Marcus, his expression shifting as realization began to replace assumption, piece by piece. The earlier certainty unraveling without a sound, and around them the crowd leaned in slightly, sensing the turn, sensing that the story they thought they were watching was not the one that was actually happening. Marcus lowered the badge slowly, meeting Ryan's eyes, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something steadier, something grounded. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow louder in meaning. You should have asked better questions. And behind him the agents were already moving, not urgently, not aggressively, just efficiently, as if they had stepped into a moment they fully understood, while Ryan stood there, still holding on to a version of the situation that no longer existed. realizing too late that the man he thought he was investigating had been observing him the entire time, and that the real line in this encounter had never been about a car, but about a decision, a single decision that could not be undone once it was made. For a few seconds, no one moved. Not the crowd, not the officers, not even the flashing lights that now felt quieter than before, because everything that mattered had already shifted, and Officer Ryan Keller stood there staring at the badge, as if it might change if he looked at it long enough, as if there was still a version of this moment where he was in control, but that version was gone, replaced by something far less certain, far more real, and Marcus Ellington did not raise his voice, did not step forward, did not demand anything. He simply watched, giving Ryan the space to understand what had just happened, because understanding, when it arrives this late, is never gentle. One of the agents stepped closer, speaking calmly, professionally. "Officer, we are going to need you to step aside." And the words were not loud, but they carried a weight that did not need volume. Ryan blinked, glancing around as if searching for confirmation, for backup, for anything that could restore the balance he had assumed was his. But the street offered none. Only witnesses, only cameras, only silence, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he took a step back, his hand dropping from where it had rested near the car, the same car he had judged, questioned, and handled with certainty just moments ago. And now even standing near it seemed different, like crossing a boundary he no longer had permission to cross. Marcus turned slightly, addressing the lead agent with a brief nod, a silent exchange. Passing between them, efficient, practiced, the kind that comes from working in sync long before this street, long before this moment. "All recorded?" Marcus asked quietly, and the agent nodded once. "Every angle," he replied, glancing toward the intersection camera, then toward the phone still held up by the crowd, and Marcus let out a small breath, not relief, not satisfaction, just completion, like a step in a larger process had been finalized. Ryan swallowed, his voice returning but lacking its earlier edge. "I did not know," he said, the words coming out slower now, measured, as if he was choosing them carefully for the first time, and Marcus looked at him, not with anger, not with judgment, but with something steadier, something that did not need to prove a point because the moment itself had already done that. "You did not ask," Marcus replied, and the difference between those two sentences settled heavily in the space between them, because one was an explanation, and the other was a truth, and around them the city began to move again, slowly, cautiously, like a scene resuming after a pause, but nothing about it felt the same. The Ferrari still stood under the lights, its polished surface now marked by the moment it had just witnessed, a silent record of assumptions made too quickly, of authority used without understanding. And as the agents began to take control of the situation with quiet precision, guiding, documenting, securing, it became clear that this was never just about a car, never just about a stop on a city street. It was about the line between power and responsibility, and how easily one can be mistaken for the other when no one stops to question it. And standing there under the fading intensity of flashing lights, Officer Ryan Keller finally understood that the moment he thought defined his authority had instead revealed its limits, not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more difficult to ignore, the undeniable presence of truth. The agents moved with quiet efficiency, not rushing, not hesitating, each step measured as if they had already rehearsed this moment 100 times, and Marcus Ellington stepped slightly away from the Ferrari, giving them space while still remaining at the center of everything. Because even without speaking, it was clear this scene now revolved around him, not the badge that had arrived, but the truth it carried. One agent began documenting the condition of the car, his voice low as he spoke, into a recorder, noting time, location, visible damage, each word precise, unemotional, while another agent spoke briefly into a secure line, confirming identities, and the sound of those calm, structured actions contrasted sharply with the earlier tension that had filled the street, because this was not chaos, this was order, and it was unfolding in a way that could not be undone. Officer Ryan Keller stood a few feet back now, no longer directing, no longer questioning, just watching as the situation redefined itself around him. His earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something heavier, the Realization that every decision he had made in the last few minutes was now part of a record far bigger than this street, far more permanent than his assumptions. Marcus glanced once more toward the intersection camera, then toward the people still holding their phones, capturing everything, and he gave a small nod, almost to himself, because this was not about proving a point in the moment. It was about what would remain after the moment was over. Chain of custody is clean, one agent said, looking up from his notes, and Marcus responded with a brief, steady, good. Not celebratory, not relieved, just acknowledging that the process was intact, that the truth had a clear path forward. Ryan shifted his weight slightly, his voice returning again, quieter now. I was doing my job, he said, but the words felt different this time. Not firm, not certain, more like a question than a statement. And Marcus turned to face him fully, his expression calm, composed, not confrontational. Your job requires judgment, Marcus replied, his tone even, controlled, not assumptions, and the distinction landed without resistance, because there was nothing left to argue against, no space left to fill with authority or volume. Only the quiet weight of what had already happened. Around them the crowd began to disperse slowly, some lowering their phones, others lingering just long enough to make sure they had seen it correctly, that what they witnessed was real, because moments like this do not shout. They settle, they sink in over time, and as the flashing lights continued to reflect off the surface of the Ferrari, now marked not just by impact but by meaning, it became clear that the car itself was no longer the center of the story. It was the evidence, the symbol of a decision made too quickly, of a line crossed without understanding, and Marcus stood there for one more second, looking at it, not with frustration, not with pride, but with clarity, because he had never been waiting for this moment to defend himself. He had been waiting for it to reveal something else entirely, something that could not be ignored once it was seen. And as the agents continued their work, building the case piece by piece, step by step, the street returned to its normal rhythm, but for one man, nothing about it would ever feel quite the same again, because the moment he believed defined his authority had instead defined his accountability, and that difference would follow him long after the lights faded and the crowd was gone. The street no longer felt like a confrontation, it felt like a record in progress, every second quietly locking into place, and Marcus Ellington stood just off to the side now. No longer the focus of suspicion, but the anchor of the entire scene, watching as the agents moved through their process with a calm that did not need to be explained. One of them carefully photographing angles of the Ferrari, capturing reflections, positions, distances, because in their world, details were not small. They were everything, and each detail told a story far more reliable than memory or assumption. Officer Ryan Keller remained where he had stepped back, his posture no longer rigid, his presence no longer commanding, and for the first time since he had approached the vehicle, he was not directing anything, he was being observed, and that shift, quiet as it was, carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Marcus glanced at him briefly, not with hostility, but with a kind of measured awareness, as if acknowledging that this moment was not just about consequence. It was about clarity, the kind that arrives when there is nothing left to interpret. Everything you did here, one of the agents said calmly, gesturing lightly toward the street, the car, the cameras, is now part of an official record, and the words were simple, but they landed with precision, because they did not accuse, they did not escalate. They simply stated what was already true. Ryan nodded slowly, absorbing it, his earlier certainty replaced by the quiet realization that nothing from this moment could be taken back, not the tone, not the assumptions, not the decisions, and Marcus turned his attention back to the Ferrari for a brief second, his eyes tracing the surface, not in frustration, not in attachment, but in understanding, because the car had done its job, it had drawn attention, it had revealed behavior, it had captured a moment that might have otherwise gone unseen, and in that sense, it was never just a possession, it was part of something larger, something deliberate. The operation stays intact, another agent confirmed, checking a tablet, and Marcus gave a slight nod, acknowledging the continuity, because that was what mattered most, not the interruption, not the inconvenience, but the fact that the truth had not been disrupted, that the larger picture was still moving forward. Ryan shifted again, his voice quieter than before, almost reflective. "I did not see it that way," he admitted, and Marcus looked at him, holding that moment just long enough for the meaning to settle. "That is the problem," Marcus said, not harsh, not condemning, just direct, because sometimes the truth does not need force. It only needs to be stated. And around them the last of the tension dissolved into the rhythm of the city, cars passing, footsteps resuming, conversations picking back up, but the imprint of what had happened remained, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. And as the agents began wrapping up their documentation, preparing to transition from scene to report, from moment to record, it became clear that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something else, something quieter, more permanent, because the real impact of a moment like this is not what happens in front of everyone. It is what follows after, in reports, in reviews, in decisions made away from the street. And Marcus stood there for one last second, composed, grounded, knowing that the situation had revealed exactly what it needed to reveal, not through confrontation, but through patience. And as he finally turned away from the scene, leaving the lights and the noise behind him, the only thing that remained was a simple, unspoken truth, that power without understanding is temporary, but truth, once seen, does not fade. The flashing lights began to fade into the background as the unmarked vehicles prepared to leave, their presence no longer commanding attention, but leaving behind something far heavier, something that could not be driven away or turned off. And Marcus Ellington stood at the edge of the scene, watching the final movements with quiet precision, as if confirming that every piece had settled exactly where it needed to. One agent approached him with a tablet, displaying a timeline of recorded footage, synchronized angles from street cameras and civilian phones, each frame aligned, each second accounted for. And Marcus scanned it briefly, not searching for errors, but confirming consistency, because in his world, truth was not a feeling. It was a structure, built detail by detail until it could stand on its own without explanation. "All sequences verified," the agent said, and Marcus gave a slight nod. "Then it speaks for itself," he replied, his voice calm, grounded, as if the outcome no longer depended on anyone's opinion. Behind them, Officer Ryan Keller remained still, no longer at the center, but not yet able to leave the moment either, because some moments do not end when the scene clears, they stay, replaying in silence, forcing a different kind of awareness. And Ryan's eyes moved once more, toward the Ferrari, then toward Marcus, as if trying to reconcile the image he had formed earlier with the reality now standing in front of him. But the two no longer aligned, and that gap, that distance between assumption and truth, was where everything had changed. Marcus turned slightly, stepping toward the agent who had been documenting the scene. "Make sure the timestamps are preserved exactly as recorded," he said, not out of concern, but out of principle, because precision was not optional. It was the foundation of everything that followed. "Already locked," the agent replied, and for a brief second, there was a sense of completion, not victory, not resolution, but closure of a step, like the final line drawn under a page that would now be filed, reviewed, and understood in a different setting, far from this street. Ryan took a slow breath, his voice returning one last time, quieter than before, almost searching. "What happens now?" And the question did not carry authority anymore. It carried uncertainty, the kind that comes when the structure you relied on shifts beneath you. Marcus paused, considering the question, not because the answer was unclear, but because the moment required it to be understood properly. "Now," Marcus said, his tone steady, measured, "the truth moves forward," and he did not elaborate, because he did not need to. The process had already begun, and it would continue whether anyone tried to stop it or not. And around them the last of the agents began to step back, closing doors, preparing to leave, their work here complete, but the impact of their presence lingering. And as the vehicles pulled away, blending back into the flow of the city, Marcus remained for a brief moment longer, looking at the street that had transformed from a simple stop into something far more revealing. And then he turned, walking away with the same calm he had carried from the beginning. Not hurried, not burdened, just steady, because he had never needed to prove who he was. He only needed the moment to reveal itself. And behind him, under the fading glow of distant lights, Officer Ryan Keller stood in the quiet aftermath, no longer defined by the authority he thought he held, but by the understanding he could not avoid. That power, when used without clarity, does not disappear, it echoes. And those echoes have a way of finding their way back, long after the moment itself has passed. The city moved on, but the moment did not for everyone. And later that night, under the sterile glow of overhead lights, the scene replayed itself on a screen in perfect clarity, frame by frame, angle by angle, every reflection, every word, every pause preserved exactly as it happened. And Marcus Ellington stood in the observation room with quiet stillness, watching not as a victim, not even as a participant, but as someone who understood how moments like these transformed into something larger, something that no longer belonged to the street where it began. One of the analysts paused the footage at the exact second the baton touched the Ferrari, the image sharp, undeniable. This is where the assumption begins, the analyst said, not accusing, not emotional, just precise. And Marcus gave a slight nod, because he had seen it already, not just in this case, but in patterns, in behavior, in decisions made too quickly and justified too easily. The footage moved forward again, showing Ryan's posture, his tone, the subtle shift in control that he never noticed while it was happening. And in that room, stripped of noise and distraction, everything became clearer, not louder, just more defined. Audio is clean. Another voice confirmed, isolating the dialogue, letting the words stand on their own, and suddenly the difference between what was said and what was assumed became impossible to ignore. Marcus folded his arms loosely, not defensive, just grounded, as if he had been here many times before, watching moments unfold into evidence, into understanding, into consequence, and behind him, through the glass, Officer Ryan Keller sat at a table, no longer in the center of a street, no longer surrounded by flashing lights, just a man in a quiet room with nothing but time and reflection. And for the first time, there were no interruptions, no distractions, no authority to lean on. Only the reality of what had been recorded, and the silence that followed each clip carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. Marcus turned slightly, looking through the glass for a brief second, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this was never about a single moment. It was about what that moment revealed. And the footage continued, showing the arrival of the unmarked vehicles, the shift in tone, the exact instant where certainty gave way to realization. And in that room, the story completed itself without needing explanation, because truth, when structured this precisely, does not argue. It stands. Everything aligns, the analyst said finally, stepping back from the controls. And Marcus gave a quiet response. Then let it speak. And those words settled into the room with a kind of finality. Because once something is seen this clearly, it cannot be unseen. And outside that room, the world continued as it always does, unaware of the details, unaware of the frames being reviewed, the voices being analyzed, the decisions beginning to form. But inside, the moment lived on, not as chaos, not as conflict, but as evidence. And Marcus stood there for one last second before turning away, knowing that what mattered had already been secured, not the car, not the scene, but the truth itself, preserved in a way that no assumption could rewrite. And as the screen faded to the final frame, one simple reality remained, quiet but unshakable, that what begins as a single moment can become something far greater when it is seen for what it truly is. Morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet light that does not demand attention but reveals everything it touches. And inside a conference room lined with glass and steel, the final report rested on the table, complete, structured, undeniable. Each page built from moments that had once unfolded on a city street, but now existed as something far more permanent. And Marcus Ellington stood at the far end of the room, looking down at the document not with pride, not with relief, but with recognition, because this was the final form of what truth looks like when it is given time to settle, when it is allowed to move past noise and into clarity. One of the senior officials closed the folder slowly, the sound soft but final. The record is clear, he said, and there was no need to elaborate, because clarity does not require explanation, it requires acknowledgement. And across the table, another voice added, procedure will follow, calm, measured, inevitable, and Marcus gave a slight nod, not as approval, not as reaction, but as understanding, because this moment was never about what would happen next. It was about what had already been revealed. And through the glass behind him, the city moved in its usual rhythm, unaware of the decisions forming within these walls, unaware of how a single moment had traveled from a street corner into a system designed to examine, to weigh, to respond. And for a brief second, Marcus allowed himself to look outward, not at the buildings or the traffic, but at the idea of movement itself, of how quickly assumptions can form and how slowly truth can sometimes need to move to catch up. And yet when it does not rush. It does not argue. It simply arrives, complete, and cannot be ignored. The room remained quiet for a moment longer, not tense, not uncertain, just settled, as if everyone present understood that nothing more needed to be said, because the evidence had already spoken. And Marcus turned slightly, preparing to leave, his posture unchanged from the beginning, steady, composed, carrying the same calm he had held on that street, because he had never needed to become louder, never needed to become more than he was. He had only needed the moment to unfold fully. And as he reached the door, one of the officials spoke again, not as a question, but as a reflection. It always comes down to the same thing. And Marcus paused, just long enough to hear it. What we assume versus what is real. And Marcus gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before continuing forward, because that was the difference that defined everything, not just in that room, not just on that street, but in every moment where power meets perception. And outside, the day carried on as if nothing had changed. But for those who had seen it, who had witnessed the shift from assumption to truth, something had settled into place, something that would not fade with time. And as Marcus stepped into the light, leaving the room and its conclusions behind him, the only thing that remained was a quiet, lasting echo, that power may speak first, but truth is always the one that stays.